Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and today I'm finally getting my Ghibli on with a fan favorite, My Neighbor Totoro. As always, the very first thing I'm going to start with is the armature, because it goes inside, so you kind of have to. Now I'm going to use a slightly thicker gauge wire on this one just because it's going to be a slightly larger scale than I usually do, but all the other processes are the exact same. I'll start by bulking up the body, and then I get started on the head. I always choose to do the head first because I'm so crap at actually like measuring things, as in I don't measure things. And by building the head first, I can sort of build the rest of the body off of it. Now, the other reason I'm doing this is because Satsuki is a oddly shaped anime girl, so you kind of have to start with the head, otherwise all the body parts are going to be wonky. So I'm going to start by making the face, poking a couple little eye holes in, and then realize that I made it way too humanoid, and I need to make it look kind of like an alien. I've also chopped her arms off because they are superfluous at this point, and I'm going to add them in later. Then we're going to start adding the ears in, and once I've got the ears in place, the head has been baked, and I can get started on Mei. Now, Mei is the exact same thing, only she's a little bit more of a ball, and a little bit less of like a alien sort of spiky bearded thing. But this little backpack that I'm putting on Satsuki is Mei's body. She's just basically a bread loaf with arms and legs. However, I'm going to take the arms and legs off once I've got Satsuki's arms in place. Once I have baked Mei's head, I put a little hood on her, strapped her onto the body, and ignore the fact that it looks kind of like a stretched out peanut at this point. There's going to be an awful lot of positioning and repositioning that you won't actually see. You're just going to kind of see the stages as I move along, so I'll try and point out where I fixed it and where I unfixed it, because that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this entire build. Now, we're ready to get started on Satsuki's actual clothing, so we're going to add her collar and little straps, and then that adorable little button that fits in the middle of her collar. Then we can get started on her dress, which I have purposefully left until now, just because I knew there would be a lot of blending to work around. So once everything's been baked, I can start adding the various limbs onto Mei. So a couple adorable little legs poking out the back, and then a teeny tiny hand, which will be hanging down her right arm, and then I'll make another hand to hang out the left one, which is draped down the back of Satsuki's, left arm. Now, again, I'm not too concerned about how these look because you won't be able to see them behind the umbrella, but if you're gonna do it right. Now, the boots are like white Uggs for whatever reason. I guess they're rain boots, but they look like Uggs. Anyways, now we are on to the final touches for Satsuki, which is adding on her hair. Now, I didn't want to add too much texture to it because the idea behind this entire sort of build video diorama thing is that I want to try and keep very much in line with the anime style. So we'll see if I can maintain that all the way through or if I start to lean back to washes and sharp edges. Now, for our big, sleepy, chunky boy, basically you're gonna get a potato's worth of aluminum foil and you're gonna turn it into a potato shape. Then a little bit of masking tape to hold it all in place, slap on some clay, and your potato has become an egg. Then to get the Totoro body, you need to add some tiny little legs on the bottom. And then, I mean, that's the gist of it. So at this point, he's essentially an egg with a face, and we could probably call it a day here. However, I do want to add a tiny bit more detail into it, so I'm going to start bulking out the face. Now, this is Totoro Mark 1. Now, the shape is perfect, but for whatever reason, I decided to give it sort of a humanoid nose, and the eyeballs are huge and way too close together. So it's kind of monkey-esque and looks a little bit like a porg, and I don't think that I like it. Also, I've added these ears in, and I'm gonna take them off because I think I got stuck thinking he's a porg because he doesn't have ears. He's got weird little tricone things up top. So first face gets smashed back in, and then I'm going to try to round out a little bit better of a shape here. We're going to go with a little bit less of a monkey look and more towards like a feline cat look. But for whatever reason, again, I thought that I would give it a human nose. I haven't quite figured out what's going on with the nose at this point, but I'm going to come back through and fix all that after. I think I started fixing it at like midnight, so I didn't actually turn the camera on, but I will point it out to you so you know what I have done. Now, in the movie, his fur is just sort of gray. Like, you can't actually see that it's fur except for those tiny little fur lines all around the edge of it. And I could have absolutely gotten away with just giving him like a smooth body and painting it gray, because that's how a lot of the statues seem to be, but I didn't want to. I wanted to make him look like a proper, fluffy spirit of the forest. So I've opted instead to go with like a proper, furry exterior. Also, I really like painting fur, so any opportunity to give like a big, fluffy, furry body, that's what I'm gonna go for. Now, I have popped the ears off at this point, as I had said before, and apparently I also pulled his eyes out, and now he looks like a fluffy demon baby. So of course I'm going to fill those eye sockets in immediately, and he kind of looks like Sonic at this point. Or he looks kind of like, especially without any of the ears, he looks way too monkey-esque for what I'm trying to go for here. So as I said before, I've come back through and fixed his face to something decidedly less monkey-esque, and his nose is much smaller, and it looks much more feline, which I think is the closest to what I'm trying to get with him. Actually, he looks like an otter, which I think is a little bit more in tow with what he would be. Accepting, of course, that he's a spirit of the forest, so he's not anything in particular. But I've opted to go with sort of the cat route, which is why the whiskers work well, and of course I made his little leaf to go on top. Now I also decided he wasn't nearly chonky enough, so I've thickened up his belly, and I will make a very soft sort of a fur by not going too hard with the texturing, and I'm not going to worry about adding those little UV-shaped arrow things on his chest. Instead, I'm going to paint those on afterwards. Now, his arms are my favorite because they're just lumps. They're just lumps that are attached to his body. So the one on the right will be hanging down, and then of course the one on the left is going to be upwards holding an umbrella. So I've got to angle that up a little bit, and then I'm going to get a little bit of aluminium, which will serve as sort of a stand-in umbrella, so that I can press the shape into his palm. That way I've got sort of a U shape to hold the umbrella, something to glue to when I finish the whole thing. Now, his little fingies are just little paw pointy things, but I think he's got like an opposable thumb. Or an opposable claw of sorts, because he's got the two in the front, or sorry, the four in the front, and then he's got one in the back when he holds the umbrella. And unless my animal anatomy is way off, I believe that that would have to be an opposable thumb.
What the f are you talking about?
At any rate, all I need to do is add the tail and then a couple pads on the bottom for his toes to go on to. And then we're on to painting. So obviously he's gonna be gray. So I'm gonna go gray all over. Basically it's just a darker gray than what we've got on here. But once I start adding that gray on and it separates the color of his belly and his body, that's when I start to realize that yes, this will actually work out fairly well and he will be obviously Totoro. Now, because the gray doesn't paint over super well with any of my really crappy paints, I've only got crappy, like, light colors. So I'm going to use just a basic white as a primer, and then I'm going to cover it with sort of a slightly off-white. This is white and bone white, I believe it is, mixed together, so that you end with just not quite white. And then, of course, the little arrows that go on his chest are going to be that same gray, and I'm just going to paint them on with sort of a thick bit of paint so that they stand out a tiny bit against the background, and then we're on to the dry brush. Now, this is why I love doing fur, because dry brush is so much fun to do over something all ridgy like this fur, so a slightly lighter gray over top to really bring out all the highlights of that fur. Then his eyes are obviously going to be a very white, and once I've got those painted in, a tiny black dot in the middle of them, and then using a pin, you can't really see it very well, but I've added just the smallest, tiniest dab of white, which will give him sort of that mischievous Totoro sparkle. Then we can paint his nose black, and the leaf on top is obviously green. And then to give the eyeballs an appropriately eyeball-y appearance, I'm going to use a little UV resin spread over the surface and then blasted with a UV light. And then the final touch will be adding black to his whiskers, and his paint job is essentially done. Then we get started on the umbrella. This is a nice and easy process to make some really nice looking umbrella handles at least. So I'm going to take a little piece of aluminum wire, and then I'm going to put a little bit of wire shrink wrap on it. So this is like the plastic shrink wrap that you put over the soldered pieces of electronics. Blast it with a heat gun and it'll tighten on. It leaves a nice sort of rubbery umbrella-y grip to it, and it is perfect for this. It also means we don't need to paint the bare wire. This just goes straight on. So once that's finished, I can attach it directly onto Satsuki, and then I'll make another one for Totoro. And then the only thing we have left to do is make the actual umbrella canopy. Of course, before we do that, we need to paint Satsuki, because it's going to be hard to get in behind the umbrella to get like her back and the little sections that would be hiding under a massive umbrella. So we'll go through the usual process. The pinkish hue for the face. She's got a bright yellow shirt and an orangish sort of dress. Now, this took maybe 15 or 16,000 coats to actually get good coverage on it. It's just because the paints I'm using are not particularly well pigmented, and things like yellow and orange and red don't go over gray super well. Of course, it would have been a lot easier if I had primed everything in a lighter color or even in those lighter shades. However, hindsight being what it is means that I just opted to do 15 or 1600 coats instead of having to do a single coat of primer. Now, yes, I realize I'm painting her hair black here, and it is brown, so I will go back and fix that. Worry not, then we can get started on the face. It should be fairly simple. Alright, so this was me trying to draw her face on with one of these acrylic markers, but the line was way too thick, so I ended up going back through with just some of the skin tone to thin out those lines. Then to make the umbrella, I'm going to use this delightful Christmas ornament bauble thing and this wonderful, wonderful fabric. So I'm going to drape it over the entirety of the bauble and then strap it underneath using some elastic bands. And then once I've got a nice tight fit over that, then I can apply some thinned out Mod Podge. Now, when this dries, it will become nice and hard and it will retain the shape of the bauble underneath. So it'll give me a nice dome. It's as simple as drawing sort of a circle into the center of that, and this will give me my layout for where I'm going to have the umbrella, so that when I come back with a pair of scissors, I can cut out a nice umbrella-esque shape. Then to add the tines, are they called tines? Is it tines on an umbrella? To add the little ribby dealies that go on the inside of the umbrella, I'm just going to use some thinner strips of aluminium wire, which I will stick to the center of the bauble using some green stuff, and then I can stick the umbrella canopy over top of that. Then I'll use a little bit of super glue to hold the tines in place. Actually, I used a lot of super glue. I used way too much super glue, and it looks hideous by the end of it, but it's the underside, so hopefully you won't see it. I also cut some straight lines from each of the tines to the other tines to give it sort of a nice batwing effect, I guess we'll call it. And then I spray painted them with some gray primer. Then I can start painting them. One is going to be purple and the other is going to be red. The purple went on really nicely. The red took, again, about 1,000,000 coats. It took so many coats. So many coats. And it still ended up being kind of a weak looking red. So something to bear in mind, prime with lighter colors and you can save yourself a lot of hassle. Then of course the only thing left to do was paint the little metal parts running up the center and all the tips. And then we're ready to glue them onto the end of the umbrella handles. So Satsuki gets the red one, and then I'm going to give a large umbrella handle to Totoro. Now I realize that it's supposed to be black, but I thought it would be fun to have it green. Give it a little bit of color, why not, right? And then the purple one goes on top of that, and those two are essentially finished. So there's still one more character to make, and that is the bus stop sign. Now I had a little piece of dowel, and I had a milk carton lid, which I glued a little bit of foam onto, and I thought that because it's sort of angled, I can cut an angle just using some knives, and it's probably one of the ugliest things that I have ever made. But we can just paint it gray and say it's concrete. So to attach the post, I'll use just a little dab of hot glue in that beautifully carved out piece of foam, and then we can start cutting out the sign itself. And then they'll get glued onto that post, and I made some tiny little metal brackets to hold it all in place, and then we can go over the entire thing in a coat of black Mod Podge, a nice metallic purple to cover the sign, a concrete to cover up that horrifying base, and then just a basic silver through the center. Then I'm ready to start writing in the timetable, so I'm going to use these tiny acrylic markers. And then I'm going to copy the kanji as best I could. I don't speak Japanese or write it, so I just kind of copied the pictures. And it looks fine. Then we're on to building the base. The first thing you'll need is some white paper, some green paint. Apply the green paint, and then apply a bit more green paint, and you'll end up with these beautifully patterned paper sheets. This is going to be the base for our grass and ferns and little bits of green life in the background. So I'm going to cut it into equal size strips, and then I'll fold it over itself so that I don't need to cut quite so many pieces out. Then I'll draw a little leaf shape onto it, and then chop out leaves, and I'll end up with these 4 delightful leaves. And then I'm going to take the rest of my strips, do the exact same thing, so that I end up with a whole bunch of leaves. Then I'm going to take a couple longer leaves that I've cut and fold them in half, and then I'm going to take a pair of scissors and cut all the way up. These are going to act as our ferns, so these are sort of the little weird things that stick out the side of the ferns. So once you unfold it and roll it around, you're left with a delightful little fern leaf. So add that to the pile. So then our final count is a bunch of tiny leaves, some long stringy grass leaves, some standard leaves, and some fern leaves. Then I'll glue all the fern leaves onto a piece of paper so that I can roll that piece of paper up, and I'm left with a adorable as heck little fern plant. So all you gotta do is glue that together, and you do the same thing to the grass, and then you can curve the blades out, and you've got some wonderful little grassy ferny bits. Then I'll glue the remaining leaves onto some floral wire to have a nice green stem, bunch them into groups, and then twist all the wires together so that they are in sort of a planty bundle. Then I'm going to take those bundles and reshape the leaves by sort of squeezing and crushing and twisting until I'm happy with the shape they're in. Then we're on to the actual ground. So to set the base in place, I'm going to use a little bit of plaster of Paris. And then that gets slopped on, and you spread it about like you're making some sort of cursed cake. It's really fun. I really like doing this. You absolutely don't need to use it, and I actually covered all of this up with sort of a mud texture. I like doing it. It's fun, it adds unnecessary weight to it, and it makes it feel expensive. Now, the road to the bus stop is basically a muddy surface, so we're gonna try making our own mud. Now, I've never tried this before, but I'm optimistic. So I'm gonna take some of that modeling paste I love so much, a little brown paint, a little black paint, mix it up, and then to give it a little bit of texture, just some bog standard sand. Then you're going to want to make sure that you find somebody else's brush to use, because it's going to ruin whatever you use. So if you have like a surplus of makeup brushes in the bathroom, go ahead and take one of those. They work really well for this sort of thing, and you can usually throw 1 or 2 of these brushes away before anybody notices. So once I've got a nice layer of the mud down, I'm going to add a little bit of flock to the back of it, just to sort of delineate where I'm going to be putting my grass and greenery. A little bit of flock over top of that just to thicken it up a tiny bit, and then I can start adding in all those little plants. And then just using some tweezers, I'm going to poke some of the much greener, brighter grass in amongst all the plant life. The reason for this is that the flock and the grass that I put on before, it was kind of nasty green, like a realistic green, and it didn't quite fit the whole motif. So I want to lay some lighter grass down. Now to hold it all in place, a nice thick coat of isopropyl alcohol, and then liberally apply some thinned out PVA glue to really tie it all in place. Then we're ready to add the big chunky boy. So he's gonna get popped in where we left that gap for his tail. Then we can put our tiny heroines into the spot beside him. And of course the most important character, the bus stop sign. And then using a little bit of that leftover mud, I'm going to blend some of those harsh seams and also put a little bit of mud on each of their boots, because they're standing in mud, they would have muddy boots. Then we're on to making the rain. Now this is one of those things that I thought would be an easy, simple process, and it's also the last thing I had to do. So I really biffed it on this one, to be entirely honest with you. I mean, I think it turns out terrific, but the amount of effort required to really make it stand out is beyond my patience, and simply beyond the amount of time I had in order to finish this video. Basically, I'm coating the entire thing in a fairly thick polyurethane to give it a nice watery look, so everything looks damp. And then I'm going to make a couple little puddles of UV resin. So I'm just kind of placing them out wherever I think that they would look nice, and then blasting them again with my black light. So the idea here was to make little rain droplets falling into these puddles. So I'm going to take a little bit of UV resin on my ball stylus and draw tiny circles, which will be the ripples where that water drops. And as long as you work fast and hit it with the UV light before it hardens up, you can actually get a nice sort of circular water droplet effect, a ripple, if you will. Then I'm gonna crack out this stuff right here, which is fiberglass cloth. Basically, it is fiberglass woven super tight, but if you pull out each of these individual tiny strands, you've got a nice strong piece of sort of spider silk that is really hard to break and is invisible. Then I'm gonna take a little bit more UV resin and then drag the fiberglass through that, and while it's beating up, I'm gonna blast it with that UV light again. Then once it's hardened, you'll get these delightful little beads on a basically invisible string. Then you can use a little bit more UV resin to lock them in place in the center of our little water droplets, and you've got rain, basically. Now, I'm gonna call this one a success with a caveat. Now, the caveat is that while this works really well, it's a project in and of itself, so it's not really the kind of thing you do at 10 a.m. the day before you plan to release your video, because just this amount of rain took me 4 or 5 hours, and the idea was to coat everything in sort of raindrops, but I lack the time and patience to do that properly. So I think what you would need to do is you build your diorama, and then come back a month later and do all the water droplets as a separate project. However, with that finished, I think we're done, and it's time to go to those glamour shots. Well, I'm not sure how I feel about this one, and I don't think a return to the world of Ghibli is completely off the table just yet. Hell, maybe even a rerun of our favorite forest-dwelling big boys in the works. And hey, if you think that kind of thing might just pique your interest, consider subscribing to my Patreon so you can see what's happening behind the scenes. Plus, you'll get a chance to hang out with some pretty lovely people, like Madison Taylor, Maddie Sousey, Wizards Beard Co., and Abel Janos, just to name a few. Otherwise, let me know in the comments below what you think, which of the Totoro designs you like the best, and what you want to see next. Until then, though, cheers.